New Buddha-ware Dhamma Talks. Jeff Hunt presents a talk on some aspect of the Buddha's teaching.
So I'd like to introduce the topic of resentment. First of all, let's understand what this thing called resentment is. Now, we mustn't get too hung up on words because words are always very fuzzy and overlapping. And of course, they also vary from time to time and from language to language. So don't take a word too seriously. It's the concept, how it works in life. What is it pointing to in our behavior and our understanding? So resentment is obviously related to anger, and it's drawn attention to by the Buddha as a hindrance or an obstacle to our following the path of awakening. It gets in the way of our meditating and clearing away everything which is a veil over our understanding of the true nature of things. So resentment falls under the heading, I suppose, of anger and hatred generally, but it does have some peculiarities, and it's actually, the more I thought about it, the more I could see it was a very important issue to confront, and I hadn't really understood its importance before. Anger is something that in general sort of flares up reactively to a particular situation, so it's kind of short-lived. It's like a little explosion, if you like, whereas resentment is more like a smouldering fire. So it's as though the anger is burning on and on for days, for weeks, for months, for years. Possibly one's entire life could be spent in resentment, and one could die in resentment, which is pretty sad. So it's like the difference between a fire flaring up and hot embers or charcoal smouldering away for a long period. Now resentment is more like the second. That is something that one is holding on to and is a burden, although one may not notice that. And that's what we're trying to do here in part, is to notice things about our states of mind, and at this stage with a view to identifying those which are obstacles to our developing wisdom and compassion for ourselves and others, and peace. I think on the face of it, you probably see immediately that resentment and peace do not go together. That's pretty obvious. But we need not to just see resentment in others, but to actually start by seeing whether it exists in oneself. Let's try to identify this thing called resentment. And it doesn't matter actually whether you call it resentment or something else. Every language will have a different, slightly different way of expressing it. As I say, it's something that's sort of smouldering, a slow burn kind of anger or hatred. But I think what is probably essential to it is a sense of being wronged, that I have been wronged by a person, by a colleague, by a group, by my employer, by society at large, because of my race, my nationality, my gender, something identifiable which I see as a source of my suffering at the hands of others. You've only got to look at the news to see how resentment is expressed in many different ways. For example, it could be expressed against politicians. It could be expressed against the royal family. It could be expressed against the banks. It could be expressed against something called the capitalist system. It could be, on a smaller scale, aimed at managers. They're one of our favourite objects of resentment. A manager, or the management generally. Now what's going on here, a number of thinkers have said that very often it's not really what it appears to be on the surface. It's not that there is a clear objective reason for the resentment. It's a perception, or it's a perception that this is what is making me angry, and it's also a projection of one's own dissatisfaction. I think in the Buddha's teaching we have to at least consider the possibility that what we're dealing with here, at least some of the time, is that instead of my taking responsibility for my feelings, my state of mind, my position, it's so much easier to project it onto someone else. Now, I don't think that's always true, but I think it often is true with a resentment. So I may resent, for example, immigrants. There's a lot of resentment against immigrants. It doesn't really make any sense, but it's a very dangerous thing. It's a source of unhappiness for the person who is resentful. But when you collectivize resentment, it becomes an extremely dangerous thing, because there are resentful people who are also politically minded, who will use the resentment of others to gain power over others. A dictator or a dictatorial type of person who has the knack of spotting resentment and turning it into a message which they reflect back at others, so that this person is then seen as their voice, can lead them into pretty awful things, because resentment is a form of anger and it's a form of hatred. So if I feel resentment against my managers, I really probably like to hurt my managers. If I have resentment against immigrants, I'd like to hurt immigrants in some way. It's a sad thing, but this is how, this is the way we human beings function, and we need to be aware of it, because there must be some way of escaping from our history, especially our recent history. You've got, even in this country, and I don't want to talk politics, but you've got in this country now an example of a person who is using resentment and projection of some of our problems onto others, onto another more or less identifiable group, as a way of making political gains. So resentment has resulted in pretty horrendous things, actually, in history. So we do have to be aware of it, and we have to acknowledge it. But it's one thing to say others are resentful. It's quite a different thing to say that I recognize resentment in myself. Try to keep in your mind this sense of somehow being wronged in some way, or that I am not getting my just deserts, or I am being taken advantage of, or others get credit for the things that I should really get credit for, or I am not recognized for being as brilliant or as clever or whatever as I really am. Now this can go on day after day, year after year, with a kind of a low-level anger directed at or projected onto some group or other, or some person. And of course, the person who is feeling resentment is not a happy person. They may not notice that, but they're not. As we learned with anger, you cannot be angry and happy at the same time. You cannot be resentful and happy or peaceful at the same time. A resentful mind is a conflicted mind. Are we saying that everyone in this room is feeling resentment? Well, I don't think so. You see, it's a matter of character, it's a matter of experience, it's a matter of what strategy you have learned in life to cope with the difficulties of life. And resentment actually is a strategy. It's a strategy for coping with disappointments and frustrations, the things we want, or getting rid of the things we don't want, the frustrations. How convenient it is to project it onto someone else. There are a lot of factors at work here. I think we all probably meet people who are almost by character sarcastic, cynical, belittling of others, will always see the worst in others, will always see an ulterior motive in things that people do, even when they're doing a good thing. What is this? To me, it's a kind of almost like a cry of pain, because the resentful person needs our compassion, in fact, resentful person is suffering. And they have found a strategy for pushing that suffering out there onto others. Because it makes sense. It makes sense of their world. It makes sense in a way. It works for them. What they don't notice is that it is eating them up. And it's a very sad thing to get towards old age and still be resentful. There is no freedom in that. There's no joy in that at all. It's the opposite, actually. It's the opposite of joy, and it's the opposite of trust in others. How do we recognize it in ourselves? Well, it may be very low level. It may be very transient. If you can catch yourself, I have caught myself out sometimes. It's usually, of course, I'm just talking to myself. Because that's the safest way to go about it, isn't it? So you see, the thing about resentment, it's often covered up, is that it's because like charcoal that's hot and burning, maybe you don't notice it. So if you've got to catch yourself unawares. It's like you might be by yourself. You might be sitting on the loo. It's probably when other people are not around that you might be thinking something very resentful that often pops up in your mind, and it's a kind of a mental habit. When you do acknowledge it, when you do see it, and it's very human, even if it's a fairly trivial level of resentment, what you need to notice is that you are pretty unhappy at the time that you're suffering. You are suffering the resentment. You see, maybe you'd like others to suffer because you've been wronged, or you feel that you've been wronged. But what is absolutely sure is that you are the one that's suffering at the time you're feeling the resentment. And you may never get to actually express angry actions towards the object of your resentment. This often follows disappointment, doesn't it? If you lose our job, then we feel a lot of resentment. Or if a relationship breaks up, first reaction, resentment. What can we learn from this? Because the Buddha is positive. He doesn't want to say, look, human beings are really a hopeless case. He's saying, we have got problems, but we also have an escape route, and that is self-understanding. That is deploying our self-awareness to understand what is going on and do something different. What do we do with resentment? First of all, to acknowledge it, which isn't easy, because actually that's not what resentment wants in a way. It wants to be convinced that it really is this other group. So saying, well, actually it could be something to do with me, is cutting across the grain there. So, but if you could just entertain the hypothesis very briefly that it might have something to do with you and your own suffering, and that you have power over your own suffering, then that could be an awakening moment. The next thing is this word forgiveness, which I just want to say something about, because I think it's often misunderstood. Now you might think, well, what I should really do, or what you might get advised to do, is to forgive. It has been noticed that forgiveness doesn't seem to work. And the reason for that is that we misunderstand what it is. What we're often being asked is that we forgive the person who is the object of the resentment. But precisely because I'm resentful, I find that near impossible. Isn't it so much easier if you see forgiveness as letting go of your own suffering? Because when you're resentful, you are suffering. You are carrying it around. The person that you're resentful about, or the group, may not even know that you're resentful. I might not even care if they did know. They might be surprised one day when you suddenly explode at them or something. They might be very surprised, because you've been carrying it secretly for a long time. But you see, forgiveness is actually honouring yourself. It is allowing what is better in yourself, allowing your own freedom. Instead of being tethered to anger, tethered to hatred, tethered to a desire to punish, well, why not just let go of the tether? You're the one holding on to it. You see what I mean? So forgiveness If we think of forgiveness as something I've got to give to another person, I find that very difficult. I don't want to give it to this person because I don't like him. Right? But if I think of it as actually something I'm giving myself, that's a good starting point. But I've got to notice that I'm actually carrying this burden and I needn't. Now, once I have started to let go for myself, it follows that I'm letting go for the other person too. The object of my resentment has now evaporated.
New Buddha Way lets go of East and West and starts afresh in the life we have now. For more information, visit www.newbuddhaway.org.